shut off the fan.
Okay, it's live now, I think.
Yeah, we can start.
Are we on? Can you guys?
It's on. We're live.
Okay, welcome to the People's Archive of Rural India. You can always visit it at www.ruralindiaonline.org. And on the request of many friends and others, we decided to have this hangout or chat on why are our farmers angry. Let me bring you up to date on what has happened in the last few hours in Maharashtra, at least. The news is, well, somewhat good. A chief minister who said he would never speak to these farmers because they were not genuine farmers, actually then set up a group of 8 ministers or something, a group of ministers to talk with them. And as of this afternoon, a certain number of measures or steps towards measures have been agreed on. One is that the price of milk in the sale of milk from now on at the point of the dairy, 70% of the realized price should go to the farmer. I mean, that's one of the things. I think they will announce that after 3-4 days, but it seems that it'll mean that the farmer gets a much better price than he or she is currently getting on that. The second is the loan waiver issue, on which a committee has been set up. But for the small farmers, the issuing of new loans will begin almost immediately, which means also that there will be a loan waiver. At the same time, they're setting up a group. There is a committee on the loan waiver, which half the members are representatives of farmers and farm organizations. But they will also set up a group to decide on who should be excluded from the scope of the waiver, so that you don't get large corporations with agricultural fronts, so that you don't get government servants who own some land and are getting some farming done on lease, that sort of stuff, that the kind of exclusions necessary for that will be worked out in the next few days according to the government. And it's interesting that they have also, so you have the loan waiver in place. At least they've declared that they will set it up. 2, the price of milk, the farmer will get a better deal when they decide how the mechanism is to be fixed. But 70% is what I'm hearing about what the farmer will get. The third is that all the cases that have been registered against farmers during the agitation will be dropped, except cases that have been filed against antisocial elements for destruction of property, etc., and some amount of sabotage that took place. But the cases against farmers, and there were very large-scale preventive detentions and illegal arrests, those will now not happen. And if all this works out by July 26th, that's well and good. Otherwise, the farm organizations will resume their agitation. Now, 3-4 very interesting things on how this started. First of all, the agitations are taking place in areas where they have not normally begun in the last decade or two. Usually, this kind of unrest in Maharashtra has started out in Vidarbha or Marathwada. This time it's happened in the relatively more prosperous areas of Nashik and Western Maharashtra. It's also interesting that whether you look at Madhya Pradesh or Maharashtra, both chief ministers began by saying they would not talk to these guys. Fadnavis said that he would only talk to genuine farmers, which is whoever agrees with him. And Shivraj Chauhan, now on a fast, after 8 farmers have died in police firings and in injuries during the agitation, is now on a fast when he could simply take action against those who opened fire and killed so many people. But the trouble begins the morning on the third year of the Modi government. The third year of the Modi government, the newspapers are full of advertisements of this government's incredible achievements in agriculture. The same, the same newspapers that carry the advertisements praising the achievements of the government in 3 years on agriculture, the front pages of those newspapers carry the news of 5 farmers shot dead in Mandsaur in Madhya Pradesh. It's also interesting that when Mr. Modi and Mr. Jetli announced that they would double farmers' incomes by 2022, they started a big chief ministerial group to go into this, and the head of that group was Shivraj Chauhan of Madhya Pradesh, now on fast. In the last few days, in refusing to speak to the farmers, there were a number of preventive detentions, illegal arrests. I was witness to some of these in Tasgaon area in Sangli. And suddenly, Mr. Fadnavis finds that he can speak to these farmers. Maybe he figured out that the farmers are searching for a genuine CM, and he's decided to speak to them. So this is where we are at right now. They have in Maharashtra come to an agreement about waiver, but it's also very important to understand that, and this is how it's unfortunately positioned in the media, it isn't just about loan and loan waiver. There are far more serious issues stifling Indian agriculture. There are far more serious problems. The loan waiver, you can go back to 2007 from when it started being discussed, and I've written on it a large number of times. Loan waivers are a tool. They're not a transformation. They're a mechanism. They're not a solution. They're a relief, not an answer. So you have also one more interesting thing on that central demand of the implementation of the Swaminathan Commission's reports. Cost of production plus 50%. I'm still trying to believe it. But apparently the Maharashtra Chief Minister, Mr. Fadnavis, will take a delegation of Maharashtra Kisans to Prime Minister Narendra Modi to ask him to implement his party's manifesto promise, which was implementation of that recommendation, cost of production plus 50%. Now this is in a bit, well, it's positive, it's also entertaining. This was the promise on your manifesto. It was a promise on the BJP's whole manifesto. Having made that promise, immediately after coming to power, the government then submits an affidavit in the Supreme Court of India saying this cannot be done. Okay? No explanations required for why you lied to the public, why you lied to the nation, why you went out and got votes on that promise when you had no intention of keeping it. Anyway, Mr. Fadnavis will take his delegation from Maharashtra and talk to Mr. Modi about the need to implement the promises they made the Indian farmer. So that's where the situation is at right now. But please, 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 and this is my appeal to you, do not try understanding the farm crisis. Do not try understanding the agrarian situation through events and episodic situations like the strike in Maharashtra, the Tamil Nadu farmers event in Delhi, or even the firing in Mandsaur. These are manifestations of the crisis. They are not the crisis. If for those of us who are not government, who are not bureaucrats, those of us who are not apologist think tanks for the Indian elite, those of us who are not number crunchers, try understanding the farm crisis through the lives of farmers, through the lives of agricultural laborers, through the lives of people dependent on farming, a much larger proportion of population than farmers is dependent on agriculture in one way or the other. You really want to understand the crisis, try understanding it through their lives, not through bogus figures and numbers manipulated to show, as the advertisements in Madhya Pradesh newspapers that morning of the firing news showed fantastic progress. Yeah. And you can, by the way, if you go to the People's Archive of Rural India, see that. Understand the agricultural crisis through the lives of farmers and migrant laborers and agricultural laborers. I'll pause there so that, I think there's a huge number of questions lined up already. I'll start trying to deal with some of them, Siddharth.
There are a few questions on email. The first one is, why are input costs so high? Why have they skyrocketed the way they have in the past decade?
I don't know if you could hear that, so I'm repeating the question that Siddharth Adilkar, our tech editor, has listed. Two of my friends here are helping me with the questions as they come in. The first question to come in is, why are input costs so high in agriculture? Why have they skyrocketed? Three things. One is the government stepped out of the responsibility of public provisioning of inputs. It stepped aside from the responsibility of seeing that input costs were held in check in the name of market-based pricing. Every government, and it's not just the BJP, it's not just Fadnavis, it's not just Mr. Modi. Every government, that of Dr. Manmohan Singh, his predecessors before him, every one of them allowed corporations to run amok with price gouging. The price of seed in the period of the liberalization, some brands of seed, the price increases over what people were using earlier have been 500 to 700%. The price of pesticides, the price of fertilizer, the price of seed, the price of a very large number of inputs that go into agriculture have doubled, trebled. So you're not talking about doubling the farmer's income in 5 years, and that's another bit of a joke, because Mr. Jaitley never clarifies for you whether he means nominal income or real income. If it's nominal income, everybody's income is going to double and treble over a period of few years. But real income, the farmers don't seem to be feeling any improvement in their real income, nor has there been one, because the last 3 years show you that agriculture-related income, not just of farmers but of that sector, have either stagnated or declined marginally. On the other hand, input prices have been relentlessly rising for 2 decades. In Vidarbha in 1993, or say in 2003, an unirrigated acre of cotton costs something like 4,000 rupees, 5,000 rupees max to cultivate. An irrigated acre of cotton cost about 10 to 12,000 rupees. Each of them. Now, an unirrigated acre is anywhere upwards of 12 to 15,000 rupees. Irrigated acre, 40,000 upwards, depending on your use of inputs. So while the costs of cultivation have doubled, trebled, quadrupled, agricultural income, the farmer's income, has stagnated. The NSS data for 2013-14 tells you that the average income of a farm household, roughly 5 people, was 6,426 rupees a month. And we're talking about 4.9 people or 5 people if you round it off, which means an average per capita income on that house, in that household, of about 1,300 rupees a month. Now we are looking at the input costs skyrocketing, the costs of seed, fertilizer, all of this going up dramatically. You also had, in the liberalization and the reforms period, a number of other measures favoring the corporations and robbing the farmer of the value of his investment in inputs. For instance, seed packets have a thing called minimum germination rate. This used to be 80-85%, which meant that if you bought a packet of seed, 80 to 85% of the seed in that packet was guaranteed to work. It's called the minimum germination rate. Starting with Mr. Chandrababu Naidu's time in Andhra Pradesh, the minimum germination rate was lowered to 60%, which means that if a village bought 10,000 bags of seed, they were paying for 10,000 bags but actually getting 6,000, because not more than 60% was mandatory to have it work. And at the same time, they were paying much more for those bags of seed than they were paying when the minimum germination rate was 80% and above. So it was a kind of loot and grab sortie for the corporations in the seed sector, in the fertilizer sector, or take DAP, diammonium phosphate. If I go back to 91, 92, 93, I don't know how many 100% the price increase has been, somewhere around 1,400 rupees or so now in many parts of the country. So you've got an astonishing skyrocketing, a gouging of the farmer in pricing by business and corporations, and you've got a shrinking or stagnant income. So that's why the skyrocketing of the input costs happened, and that's why it's crushing the farmers so badly. And that's why the issue of prices for their produce is so central.
Sainath, the next we have over email, we have one of those where were you questions. Where
Sure.
were you when in the last 17 years of the Congress government, was there no agrarian crisis?
I love these. Where were you on the night of January 16th questions? Okay. The question that's come in wants to know where I was when there were 17 years of Congress rule and what was I saying about agriculture then. I really think the question should be where the questioner was and whether the questioner is literate and can read. In the over 250 reports that I put out in the Hindu on the agrarian crisis, and please don't confuse that with farm suicides. The agrarian crisis is a much larger thing than the farm suicides. The bulk of my reports were critical of and written under a Congress UPA government, a Congress NCP government in the state, Mr. Vilasrao Deshmukh being the chief minister for most of that period, succeeded by Mr. Ashok Chavan, on whom I did the story that took him to the Supreme Court on paid news, went to the Election Commission, and Mr. Prithviraj Chavan. And at the center, Mr. Sharad Pawar, who was the agriculture minister, presiding over the largest number of those farmers' suicides in his 8-10 years as agriculture minister. If you go back, if you just are literate and can read, then just Google for articles on the agrarian crisis in that period and see which byline comes up most. It was incredibly critical of policy, whether those policies are implemented by the Congress or the BJP. Let me say it categorically. In terms of the economic policies and the policies towards agriculture, there has not been a gigantic difference between the two formations, the Congress UPA and the BJP NDA. With the Congress UPA having been longer in power, you will find that the bulk of my work, which is very critical, is under that period and is directed at the then government. So please, you can also simply check that out by speaking to Mr. Sharad Pawar, provided he doesn't have an apoplexy on hearing my name. Yeah.
We have more than nearly 350 people watching, and the questions are coming in thick and fast, Sainath.
So let's try answering. I believe there are hundreds of questions in line. Let me try.
Prasenjit Das Gupta has asked the question: does cost of production plus 50% of MSP include factoring inflation? There are several other expenses which is applicable to farmers as well. Example, medical, education, cost of living expenses.
Exactly. I think, Prasenjit, that's a damn good question. In fact, when this principle is accepted at all, they're going to even have to figure out what is the cost of production. Yeah. Now, Maharashtra, the state government puts out its estimate of the cost of production of 1 acre of paddy or 1 acre of sugarcane. These are dramatically different from what farmers put out as their cost of production per acre. So one of the things we're going to have to do is to really have a serious, fair laying out of what is the cost of production per acre. As it stands, even the government estimates, which are much lower than those of the farmers, have shown in several years that the cost of production, that the price the farmers are getting is actually less than the cost of production. But I think it's a very important thing. The second point I think you've made, which is very important, is a farmer is not just a farmer. She or he have got kids to send to school and college. They've got medical costs. Indeed, medical expenditures are the second fastest or the fastest growing cause of rural family debt. So all those things have also got to be figured in. And it's one reason I'm saying that to get this discussion seriously, one of the few demands that I have been making, appeals I have been making, is that we need a special 10-day session of Parliament just devoted to the agrarian crisis. 1 day to the study of the Swaminathan Commission reports and a debate on it. 2, 1 day where we just get testimonies from, just testimonies from farmers, from the widows of those who've committed suicide, from those who have not committed suicide and are struggling, and not from corporate shills, touts. We need testimony from the farmers, that 1 day, but you need a 10-day special session to discuss the agrarian crisis. We could then have each and every one of these issues, whether it's a loan waiver, whether it's the price of milk, whether it's the input costs, what are the various things that can be done? You can have such a discussion.
Shivanesh Pandian Umakeshan asks, where does the money for loan waiver come from for the government?
Okay. Sorry, what's the name?
Shivanesh Pandian Umakeshan.
Okay. Shivanesh Pandian wants to know, where does the money for the loan waivers for government come from? Firstly, I think you need to understand the mechanics of what these loan waivers are. I'm very skeptical how they have turned out to be. In 2008, in fact, when the UPA government announced what was to be a 70,000 crore waiver, and actually turned out to be 50,000 something crore waiver, if you look at it, it never even reached the bulk of those farmers in whose name it was made. The crisis that drew attention of the nation to the farm crisis was burning in places like Vidarbha and Anantapur, Rayalaseema, parts of Telangana. But Mr. Pawar and the UPA, Congress UPA, declared a loan waiver on A, not for anyone above having more than 5 acres of land. B, it was a March to March, financial year waiver, and it never won. And 3, it dealt entirely with bank debt. The bulk of farmer debt is private debt. Okay? And the bulk of those farmers who were suffering, many of them didn't have a bank account, they didn't have bank loans, and they were completely excluded from a waiver made in their name. Second, when you set an acre limit, you are obliged to say how many acres for irrigated land, how many acres for unirrigated land. Now in Vidarbha, the average land holding is unirrigated, it's mostly unirrigated land, and the average land holding is about 7 acres. In Western Maharashtra, It's half that, the average land holding, but it's very well irrigated. Your 2 acres in Western Maharashtra are incredibly more productive than 10 acres in Vidarbha. So when Mr. Pawar did this, he did it knowingly. He did it very clearly, knowing who it would benefit and who it would not. The farmers who needed it most, unirrigated, dryland farmers, they were excluded. A, they didn't have bank accounts. B, they were above 5 acres. In a number of ways, they were shut out. Just if you look at Maharashtra alone, out of Maharashtra's 35, 36 districts, 53% of the value, 53% of the value of the waiver went to 6 districts, mostly in Western Maharashtra. Okay? It did not have, and that's why it's a very good thing that today the Kisan representatives compel the government to take note of this anomaly and not repeat this blunder. The other thing about waivers in general, the other thing about the waiver of 2008 was that, say, sugarcane farmers got an extra year of benefit as against cotton farmers because of the seasonality of cropping of that particular product. All this was done very consciously. Okay? It was not an accident. The money for the waivers, the central government has, as you can see from the budgets, made one loan waiver. The first loan waiver nationally was under Chaudhary Devilal for farmers at about 10,000 rupees was the cutoff point for every farmer, and that was in the 1980s. The next one was 2008. For the corporate sector, the government routinely writes off lakhs of crores of rupees every single year in the last 20. And you can look at it from 2006-2007 budget onwards. There used to be an annexure called Statement of Revenue Foregone. The foregone revenue there includes, say, direct corporate income tax. In 2015, that was 78,000 crores. Customs exemptions on gold, diamonds, and jewelry, 73,000 crores, all Aam Aadmi items, right? Gold, diamonds, and jewelry. Having made all these concessions, these are concessions that largely benefit the top 1 to 5% of the population. In 2015, the amount was 5,34,000 crores for 1%, 2% of the population, as against the 56,000 crores of 2008 for 40 million families or farmers. So, the money is there. Okay, there is enough money to give. There was enough money to give Vijay Mallya 9,000 crores of public money, and he's living in a flat in Mayfair. The question is, who is getting the money? The money is there. Who is getting farm credit? Who gets, when minister after minister has said, Pranab Da has said it, Chidambaram has said it I don't know how many times, Mr. Jaitley will tell you that we have doubled agricultural credit, we have trebled agricultural credit. Oh yes, they have. It's just that it doesn't go to the agriculturist. They've doubled farm credit, but not to the farmer. If you look at the loans that small farmers take, below 50,000, below 2 lakhs, Professor Ramakumar of TISS has done some, brilliant work on this to show you from RBI data, and he and Dr. Pallavi Chavan, showing you that the lower end of the loans have collapsed. And loans above 1 crore, loans above 5 crores, loans above 10 crores have exploded. How many peasants do you know who are taking loans of 10 crore and above? Well, I could think of 2 or 3 names. I mean, one is Mukesh, the other is Anil, the third is Ramdev, but I'm sure there are many whom you know. But generally, the Indian peasant is not into taking 1 crore, 10 crore. Why don't we ask, where does the money come from that? That comes from public money. Yeah. And then these are converted into NPS. Then first they will go through restructuring. And then the person owing the loan ends up in a flat in Mayfair, perhaps, or in Cayman Islands or some other exotic destination. Yeah. There has been, within the increase in agricultural credit, a tremendous diversion of credit from that small and marginal farmer to large businesses and corporations. That's why it's important, even in the current loan waiver, to create a distinction to see that this sort of person does not benefit from it.
We received quite a few questions on one particular issue, particularly from Priya VK Singh, Archana Rao, Ronnie J. Kuntanam, about GMO. Your opinion about GM seeds, GMO, and about the scientific studies on GMO, their impact on farmers.
Again, they have opened the floodgates. They've opened the floodgates by getting into GM mustard. And again, remember that this is the second government to try it. The first government at least retreated on the BT brinjal. Yeah, I think that it is devastatingly a terrible mistake to get into it, and to get into it in terms of GM for food crops, that to my mind is a criminal act. Okay? And notice that the Supreme Court appointed committee of scientists asked for a moratorium on such crops. I mean, I don't remember whether it was 50 years or an indefinite moratorium, but they did not support it. I think that what you're seeing is one of the biggest, most gigantic PR, the incredible PR machinery funded with millions of dollars, buying up, science for rent in India, scientists for rent in India, whereas the Supreme Court committee, appointed committee with some of the finest scientists of this country, advised you against it, advised you against venturing into this direction. When you do not have safeguards, you do not know enough, you have not studied it enough. And I will also say this, that the excuses on which it is being done, that GM is going to increase your productivity, that is absolute nonsense. Okay. The giant studies done by organs of the United Nations show you that this is not so. And incidentally, and a lot of people don't understand this, you can look up the FAO reports of 2014-15. 70% of the world's food still comes from small farms, from family farms and small farms. It does not come from corporate agriculture, which is also the most highly subsidized agriculture in the world. Okay. If BT seeds were incredibly so productive, why did the United States have to subsidize its cotton exports? If the whole system they were working under was so incredibly brilliant, and not just technologically but price-wise, why would you have to be subsidizing that agriculture with the highest subsidies in the planet? Yeah, I think that if you hand over accepting the GM, the GM guys in food crop in this country will be handing over your agriculture to some of the nastiest corporations on the planet. And unfortunately, and it will be allowing corporations to control the world by its belly. In 2012, if you go back and look at the Hindu of that time, we did a very major story, I did that story, on the fraud in projecting the success of BT cotton. You can go back and look at that story. I think the headline was "Reaping Gold Through Cotton and Newsprint," something like that. And it showed you how a systematic, fraudulent attempt to boost BT was Project BT as having achievements which it never had, was exposed in the Hindu in that story. A parliamentary standing committee on agriculture came down there, saw it from 14 different political parties, and they still came up with a unanimous position on the scale and nature of the fraud.
Sainath, we have a couple of questions on microcredit and if they can fix this problem. We'll take two, three questions at the same time. The other question that few people have talked about is agricultural sustainability, and if there is a larger game plan, some people pointed conspiracy to push out farmers to make way for corporates.
Okay, the first about, of course, I mean, is there a larger game plan? I don't think it, I think it's a very explicit, I think it's a very explicit policy drive that you want to reduce, I mean, that you're trying to take people out of agriculture and put them God knows where, because you haven't created a single option in industry. What jobs have we created in the last 25, 30 years to absorb those leaving agriculture? And indeed, many people would love to leave agriculture. You've created them no option. 30, 40 years ago, a person leaving Ratnagiri or Raigad in Maharashtra came to Mumbai and became a mill worker. Today, the person coming from Ratnagiri, today the mills are real estate owned by Godrej, Ambani, Tatas and others. And the peasant arriving from Raigad, Ratnagiri or Talegaon or wherever, the options are to become somebody's domestic servant. Okay? So one, you are creating a gigantic pool of cheap labor without giving anyone a job, right? And secondly, of course, you are pushing farmers out to the benefit of corporations. Please note that between the 1991 census and the 2011 census, the number of main cultivators, that is, the farmer who is dependent on farming, works on it for more than 180 days, that population has declined by 15 million. It means the dropout rate of farmers from agriculture is over 2,000 per day. Now, if you have succeeded in pushing out 15 million people from agriculture, you have not created 1% of the jobs for those 15 million people, but you've pushed them off agriculture. Obviously, you have a clear idea that you are going to, well, Mr. Chandrababu Naidu in his McKinsey report, Vision 2020, stated explicitly that his aim was to get 40% of people off the land. Where they would go to was a question never addressed. Okay, so yes, there is a clear idea. The dropout rate of the farm population. Now, when 15 million people drop out, where are they going? Where are they going? You can look at it in the census primary abstract. Take my home state of Andhra Pradesh, the unified state, for which data exists. In 2011, there was a 1.3 million drop in the population of farmers. And 2 columns away, there is a 3.4 million increase. 3.4 million increase in the population of agricultural laborers. So you know where they're going. Not only where dispossessed farmers are going, but dispossessed other sections of agrarian society that are dependent on agriculture. Of course, they're being pushed out. And you've started these farmers, producers, organizations, which are simply going to lead to farmers becoming laborers, serfs, agricultural workers on their own land, working for corporations. That is absolutely clear. About microcredit, for heaven's sake, microcredit is a solution. The RBI and others are desperately trying to find a solution for microcredit. Okay? Microcredit, as I have said very often, is a legitimate tool. It became a tyranny. It's never meant to be a transformation. Nobody's lives were ever transformed by being placed in debt. And nobody's lives were transformed by being placed in debt at interest rates of 30% and above. It became so bad that in 2012, the RBI came out with a fatwa saying that MFIs cannot charge more than 26%. If the RBI was saying that they cannot charge more than 26% interest, imagine what the heck they must have been charging. In the Andhra Pradesh legislature in 2006, you had a chief minister say these guys are worse than the village moneylender, who at least is rooted in the population and can be argued with them. The microcredit thing is not going to solve your problem. It has in fact put many, many people in much deeper debt, and you're going to have your own version of a subprime or whatever lending crisis over there, because much of that debt is never going to be repaid. Microcredit is a legitimate tool at the village level, and precisely the word emphasis on the word is micro. It's not going to solve your macro issues. It's not even going to be an approach to solving.
I'll take two other questions together. One is the interplay of Manrega and does it increase labor costs in agricultural sector? And the second one is about cattle trade and the interplay of cattle trade with the agricultural products.
Boy, those are two hellishly big questions. One on Manrega and two on the cattle trade.
Wait for the third one, it's water crisis.
Yeah. Well, Manrega, the cattle trade, water issues, these are all parts of this crisis of agriculture and what we call the agrarian crisis. They're all parts of they're part of the larger crisis of rural and urban India. Please do understand that the agrarian crisis is not something that's only going to affect rural India. It has serious implications for the whole country. Now on Manrega, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program is something that I would describe as very desirable, not sufficient. Okay, and there have been many attempts. Well, the minute the Modi government came to power, it slashed budgets for Manrega while claiming to increase them. We know there were some 6,000, 8,000 crores of unpaid duties, of unpaid dues. They club all that into a figure, give you some 38,000 crores number, and say this is the highest amount ever, ignoring the fact that the very first Manrega budget in 2005, I think, was 40,000 crores. Secondly, that amount is for tens of millions of workers for tens of millions of working days. Now, you remember I said the 5,34,000 crores that you gave to the top 1%. Imagine how many years you could run Manrega on it. You could easily run Manrega for maybe 105 years of the total amounts given away in the revenue foregone over a 10-year period. Probably you could run Manrega at present levels, the rural employment guarantee, at present levels for about a century. However, the question also was, how does it affect labor? How does it affect? Of course, it affects wages. And when you've got wages as low as they were in the Indian countryside, you're going to have to raise those wages. You're going to have to raise those wages. And secondly, there is also a sleight of hand here to show a complete compartmentalization between farmer interest and labor interest. Some of the biggest beneficiaries of the rural employment guarantee have been small farmers. Because when you give someone 100 days per household of work, in very big households, agricultural labor households, they have 8 people, they have 10 people. Their 100 days or 150 days gets over in 10 or 15 days. And then they've got to go somewhere else and work. So many of them simply don't wait for Narega, like in Odisha, for instance, where it keeps failing because people are migrating to do work at half the rate of Narega. They're willing to go to the exploitative brick kilns of Andhra Pradesh because there is an assurance of 150 to 180 days work on 2 occasions across 2 events or seasons in the year. Whereas your Narega, after about 15-20 days, you've finished your quota for the year. So those who were small farmers, who had 90 days, 100 days work on their own lands, they indeed benefited from this quite a bit. So you'll find that many farmers wear 2 hats on this. They're angry about it when it comes to having to, in the season, when they have to hire labor, and they're desperately dependent on it in the off-agricultural season when they need the work that Narega does. Now, there are various ways one can address that conflict. One can address that conflict by seeing that Narega goes into the creation of particular kinds of assets that benefit the village as a whole, benefit its agriculture as a whole, so that problem can be sorted out. But what the government has done since it has come to power, and let me say that Mr. Chidambaram was already damaging Narega like anything. He was never in favor of it. He did considerable damage. Dr. Manmohan Singh held that program very reluctantly. He didn't care for it either. And the BJP are simply carrying on that tradition. They cut, on coming to power, 53% of the budget of Tripura, the number one performing state in rural employment, but doubled the allocation for Gujarat, where almost all the work is machinery. Yeah, NREGA, important, not sufficient. Try withdrawing it, you will create incredible misery you already have. The second thing was about the cattle trade. Okay. Well, what does one say? I mean, you got a bunch of clowns in power in this state, for instance, who, when they brought in this ban, extended their ban in step 1 in 2015-16, you had the unedifying spectacle of lions and tigers at the Bombay Zoo being fed chicken. Okay? I don't know if you have a sense of how many chicken you'll have to kill to feed a lion, let alone a pride. I mean, it would be some sort of aviary genocide or something like that. But that's what you have to do to be able to feed. Anyway, it all went awry as it would. But the collapse, they have no sense. Neither the UPA nor the BJP had any sense of the livestock crisis already in the making. Please notice there is a thing called the livestock census, held every 5 years. 2005, 2012, there will be one this year in 2017, and I'm very sure they will doctor it like they have been doctoring the data on every major source in this country. But if you look at there is already a livestock crisis, and the cattle slaughter ban, the way it's organized, is going to sharpen that livestock crisis dramatically. When you had this ban already being initiated in Maharashtra before this year, I mean in 2015-16, what did you have? One, of course, the aim was very simple. You wanted to let the Muslims have it, right? That's your hatred. That is the RSS. That is the VHP, the BJP. That's who they are. They have no sense of how the role of the cattle and the role of the cattle in rural economy. They have no sense of it. So when the first step, of course they hurt Muslims. Muslims are very numerous in the butcher community. Not all of them are, but many of them are. So you hit them. And you also hit their diets. You've hit the diets of many poor people, not just Muslims. Second thing that happened was a collapse in cattle prices at the market and in cattle sales at the markets. A probationer in the IAS is taught at the Masuri Academy, or when he goes on his or her probation trip, you are taught that if cattle prices if prices at the cattle market fall by 30%, if transactions fall by 40-50%, you have a serious crisis in that area. In Vellore in Tamil Nadu, 10 days ago, those transactions fell by 80%. The prices fell by 50-60%. In Maharashtra, the prices fell by 60%. Transactions, we don't have a figure, but we know it's well over 50% decline in transactions. Now the dalals, the commission agents, the workers, the ancillary groups that work and are dependent on the cattle markets are mostly OBCs. Then come the Marathas, the farmers, many of whom are Marathas who keep cows. They can no longer sell, buy, or maintain cows. Some of them in 2016 early were watching their cows die, saying, look, we don't have water and food to feed our families. How will we feed this animal? So we just have to watch our own creatures die. If they were trying to take it out to the market, they were going to be physically assaulted and lynched. And every day you read in the newspaper, only what's reported, which is a fraction of what's going on, of people being assaulted, viciously beaten up, lynched, murdered in the name of cow protection. Now here's another thing about and then the Kolhapur leather industry has of course collapsed, which was a global brand name before Mr. Modi and his Make in India were born. Okay. So the leather industry, so the Dalits have taken a hit, the Adivasis have taken a hit, your OBCs have taken a hit, your Marathas have taken a hit, the farmers have taken a hit, the minorities, of course, the Muslims and Christians have taken a terrible hit. And you persist with this regardless. The other part of it is what's been happening to cattle. Livestock have been in decline. The total livestock, and particularly desi breeds, have been declining quite badly, quite sharply in the last 10-15 years. You can see that in the 2007 census, livestock census. You can see it in the 2012 census, where there is an absolute drop in the livestock population. And look at the kind of livestock where the numbers are reducing. Small animals are seeing a very major reduction. Pigs, goats. Who keeps these? Adivasis, Dalits, poor OBCs, poor farmers, landless laborers. These are the sort of people who keep these small animals. And of course, you have agricultural laborers who might own a pair of bullocks, which they lease out for plowing, for various kinds of farm work. So small animal population has declined very sharply, and that's apart from mules and camels, which were even earlier in decline. And pigs and goats have been going down, and deshi breeds of cattle. I think in the last census, if I'm not mistaken, there was something like a 9% decline. Now you are losing some of your species that evolved over millennia to Indian soils, to Indian foods, to Indian weather, to our climate. And because of 30 years of trying to introduce exotic species, regardless of whether they were suited to the climate, to the weather, to the kind of food available, and whether the small and marginal farmer to whom you have gone and distributed these programs can even afford to eat them, can even afford to feed them. It costs a great deal of money to look after a Swiss Brown or a Holstein or a Jersey, or even what we cutely call an Ada Jersey, okay? A half Jersey breed, which is an Indian cow inseminated with Jersey semen. And you find in report after report I had done, I found that the small farmers who could not afford to feed that animal were in fact going bankrupt over it. Kamlabai Gude in Vardha told me 10 years ago about a particular buffalo the Prime Minister had distributed. At that time, I begged the government of Maharashtra and the central government, do not go for this. These are not cattle breeders, and you're giving them animals they can't afford. If they had the money to feed that animal, there was no agrarian crisis. They wouldn't need your help. Instead, they kept those animals. In many cases, the animals were given at soft loans, 25%. And people were paying back that money after the animal died within 6 to 12 months. Kamlabai Gude, an old farmer in Vardha, I found her taking her buffalo around the village, trying to give it away. The Prime Minister's buffalo. Okay? And I asked her, why are you trying to give away this bais? Kamlaji said, Saab, ye bais nahi hai, ye booth hai. It eats more than my entire family. I met another farmer the night the Prime Minister's program was declared a success. He was drunk. He was an educated guy with a BSc. He came and tried telling me to buy his buffalo. I said, listen, I'm a journalist. What will I do with your damn buffalo? He said, no, it's not any ordinary buffalo. It's the Prime Minister's buffalo. So I said, okay, it's the Prime Minister's buffalo, so what? I can't buy it. I mean, I wouldn't know what to do with your buffalo. And obviously you don't either because you're trying to sell it away. Then he said, I have one demand. If you're a reporter, will you take out your notebook and note down my demand? The then pay commission of finance commission had just been announced. He said, my demand in the next pay commission for all the babus, don't give them salary increases, give them one cow or one buffalo, just like the one I have been given. Give them 1 acre of land also to raise that cow or buffalo. Yeah, you give me the salary increase and give the babus the buffalo. Yeah. So our tinkering in the bovine sector has been disastrous. And the breeding and hybriding is a very complex, demanding, delicate process which needs to be studied very carefully before you introduce something that is of no value, that is going to double people's costs. People with many of these exotic species who are very poor are unable to afford having the veterinarian almost live in their homes. So I think that you're going to see when you made the purchase, sale, and maintenance of cattle so difficult, you're going to see a huge increase in strays. People will abandon their old cattle. In Uttarakhand and Maharashtra, parts of Maharashtra, they're already doing that. They abandon the cattle at the edge of the forest for the leopards. Yeah. So you're going to see maybe an increase in population because the number of strays will go up. And then you're going to see a further sharp decline in the cattle population. The trend of 2012 will sharpen after a few years. So you're really going to hurt the cattle economy. It's not, industry is now whining about it because they're talking about the losses of so many billions in export of hides, the loss of so many billions in the export of meat. Incidentally, the highest point ever reached in the export of beef was under the Modi government in its first year. So industry is worried about it from that point of view. You and I should be concerned about it from the livelihood point of view, from the diets of people, from whether you have a right to impose on someone a diet or a dietary restriction of your will and your making, which I think is a gigantic infringement on somebody's basic rights. You said that apart from the cattle,
there was a question. Have we handled the groundwater and water?
Groundwater, okay.
And there's one specific question from Abhishek Paul Yelmachilli about rain guns, which is related to the water issue.
I wouldn't know enough to pontificate on that, but the thing is, now that the monsoon will settle in, the media will stop covering the water crisis. The entire approach of media and government to water crisis is that it is the monsoon. It's a problem of meteorological failure. This allows us to blame nature. It allows us to absolve ourselves of the responsibility for a mega water crisis that was man-made, human-driven, and created and sustained by human agency. What you have seen in the last few years is not just any drought. It's a mega water crisis. If it's just rainfall, hold on. What share of your irrigation? 60% is coming from groundwater. What share of your drinking water is coming from groundwater? And how much of that is getting depleted each year? How much of it do we recharge? Every year there's a gap between the water extracted and the water recharged, and the recharge that takes place in groundwater. But that's not the only thing. We have a mega water crisis that will not go away even if you have 5 good monsoons in a row. To just blame it on rainfall is to suggest that drought is merely the outcome of meteorological failure. We have had a significant phases of hydrological drought. We have a groundwater depletion. We have many kinds of drought, meteorological, hydrological, all this coming together to create a very serious super drought, which will show up in some years, recede in other years because rainfall does not bring solutions, but it does bring a relief for a season and maybe a bit of recharge, not enough. So unless we are addressing the larger questions of water, of inequality in water use, you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to be able to even begin to solve your problem. In Maharashtra, which has had a gigantic water crisis, RTIs done by Priyanka Kakotkar in the Times of India show you that cities and towns get 400% more water than villages, though the water comes from rural areas. We're talking about drinking water. Okay? Water comes from those areas. I live in Bandra Reclamation in Mumbai. We have 24-hour water. Most of Mumbai's water comes from 5 lakes in the Adivasi district of Thane. Look for piped connections in the Adivasi households. You have a very serious mega crisis and a moral crisis. The way we use water, what we are using it for, what kind of cropping we are doing, what kind of agriculture we are doing. It's not that you should not grow sugarcane, but you can grow sugarcane where you have perennial rivers, where you have the water for it. In Maharashtra, we grow it in large areas that are chronically drought prone. Takes up to 18 million liters of water. You can see Professor Neelakantharat's calculations on that. So you've got something like 3 to 4% of farmers, 2 to 3% of farmers on 6 to 8% of land using 65 to 70% of Maharashtra's irrigation water. Why would you not have a crisis? You've got to have an entirely different approach to water. You've got to say, when it comes to drinking water, for instance, you've got to look at, is it a commodity or is it a human right? There are governments and countries that have introduced it as a constitutional right that you cannot privatize water. Now, in the Marathwada drought, the poor woman standing in the queue at the tanker for hours, in which she was losing money from income, paid between 45 paise to 1 rupee per liter of water. In the same Marathwada are 24 alcohol and beer factories, which were getting the same water at 4 paisa per liter for several million liters daily. The poor woman was paying 45 paise to 1 rupee per liter, and the beer and alcohol factories were getting it at 4 paisa per liter, and that's an improvement. For 20 years or so, they got it at 1 paisa per liter. So you need to start looking at the larger water crisis. You ought to look at the gigantic diversions of water that are taking place from rural to urban, from urban to urban luxury, from livelihoods to lifestyles, from village to cities and towns, from food crop to cash crop, from agriculture to industry. There are these huge diversions taking place in water, unbelievably, incredibly stupid projects. Well, maybe they're not stupid. They made tens of thousands of crores for somebody, like the ones like the irrigation scams in Maharashtra, that have spent 70,000 crores in 10 years without producing a drop of irrigation. So you need to look at all this to understand what the water crisis is. And you need to have a serious rethink on use of water, defining whether water is a right or a commodity, on prioritizing which sectors of irrigation you're going to use your water for, and who gets to control water. If you privatize it, you're there.
The last two questions that we can take now, we'll take a 10-15 minutes extension, let's say. Last two questions are, one set of questions is, can you talk about a few policies that you think were well done or that have helped farmers in India or in other countries? There have also been questions about land reforms and other things about land redistribution. And the second question is, where do you see our farming 50 years from now, and is there hope?
I'm sorry, sir, it's a question.
Yeah, there was a question on decriminalization of suicides and the numbers in suicides. Will that
Okay,
the mental health bill?
yeah, well, this is on the farm suicides. There's a question. Yes, will the decriminalization of suicide affect the collation of suicide numbers? Hello, I have news for you. The suicide numbers were destroyed in 2015. They were destroyed from the 2014 data onwards. The integrity of the data collection process of the NCRB is completely compromised by political influence. Even then, so they've done all kinds of methodological fiddles that make it impossible for you to compare the suicide figures of 2015 and 16 NCRB reports with the earlier 19 years of data that exist. But in any case, even in the messed up data, let me point out something, and it will give you a link to what's happening in Mandsaur, in Maharashtra, in Madhya Pradesh, 3 BJP ruled states, all of which were once Congress ruled and produced similar results, but have sharpened. The 3 BJP states of Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh today account for well over half the farmers' suicides across the country. I'm talking about just farmers, not the other categories that they have imposed on the data. Just the NCRB figures for farmers' suicides in 2015, these 3 states accounted for 68% of all farmers' suicides across your 29 states and 7 union territories or whatever that is. In 2015 data, they accounted for 56% of all suicides. So even after further fiddling the data, even after further fudging the methodology, still 3 states account for well over half the farmers' suicides. And that should tell you, that it should not surprise you that there is agrarian unrest in those states. I'm not saying that the farm suicides are the agrarian crisis. Far from it. The farm suicides they are the outcome of the crisis, not its origin. They are the consequence of the crisis, not its cause. They're a manifestation, a symptom of things going wrong. Right? So you have here though their own data, the government's own data, telling you that these 3 states, all ruled by the BJP. And here's very interesting politically, comes up, when protest comes up, when dissent shows up, the first reaction is it's a conspiracy. These are not genuine farmers. In Madhya Pradesh, Mr. Chavan spoke only to one farm union, which is an RSS front. Then they got frightened. Now Mr. Chavan is trying to divert attention with his hunger strike. Mr. Fadnavis is trying to broker peace because he's realized that they are genuine farmers. Now, on the farm suicides, we have seen in the last 2 years a situation where maybe the suicides are going up, the numbers will come down because of the fudging of the methodology. That's another conversation. You had 2 more questions.
About schemes and policies that can work
Other countries
in other countries and other states.
Well, in schemes and policies that have worked, there were 2 questions, I think. One was about land reform.
Yeah.
It's an incredible perversion of the last decade that today when we use the word land reform, they're talking about giving over land to corporations. Yeah. That was not what land reform meant. It meant ending particular kinds of agrarian relations. It meant ending bondage. It meant taking over surplus land. It meant changing the nature of relationships on that land. It meant redistribution of land. Reform meant a very serious and deep thing. Today it simply means hand it over to the corporations, which is what governments are working towards. One of the things that did work certainly better in the past was the credit system. Okay? You had, at the time India became independent and up to the early 1960s, less than 16% of bank branches were rural. 84% were urban. By 1993, nearly 60% of bank branches were rural and 40% were urban. From then onwards, in the next few years, the number of rural branches takes a devastating hit until about 2010-11, when there is some rectification in terms of rural branches. But you have thousands of rural branches shut down. You have a diversion of credit away, as I said already, from small farmers, from agriculturists, towards large corporations. That did not work. It did not work that way 20, 30 years ago. So yes, there were things that worked better. You had areas, you had states where there was something called land reform. You had states where you did something differently. But very importantly, you also had an importance and emphasis given to the farm sector. You had policies that treated the farm sector as important. If you look at the last budget of Vishwanath Pratap Singh, the share of the share of his expenditure on agriculture is about double that of what follows in the next state budgets. Okay? I mean, annually. So you had a shrinking, huge fall in expenditure on that sector. It did work differently. It worked better. When we keep talking about drought, we had an approach to agriculture that was mitigating something in a very different fashion. You had in the Bihar drought of 67-68, in the Maharashtra drought of 72, you had public action. You had the idea of a drought in the countryside treated as something terrible, and thousands of people, students, activists, workers, volunteering to go and work in the countryside to help, like Jayaprakash Narayan led that effort in Bihar in 67-68, in Palamu. You had a number of things that worked better. I'm not saying that things were great, but they worked better. Now you have completely shifted the focus away from the farmer, from farming, from agriculture. And you face the consequences of that. There are many things you can do. Okay, to start with, look at the 4 volumes of the Swaminathan Commission, the National Commission for Farmers, headed by Dr. Swaminathan. Again, I'm suggesting, let's have a 10-day parliament session on agriculture. Let's have a 10-day session where we discuss that. What are the things we can do? Can you make agriculture a public service? Can you ensure that there is a decent pension system for people remaining in the lowest wage sector of the population, of the economy? So yeah, there are lots of things that have happened elsewhere that can be done. And you have something very good happening in the state of Kerala. One of the least covered in the media is the women's movement called Kudumbashri. I would say that this is one of the most positive things happening connected to agriculture that I have seen in 35 years. This women's movement is, I think, the greatest anti-poverty, gender justice movement that I have ever seen. It's got 4.2 million members, all women. Indeed, now there's a small Kudumbashri for men that has sprung up, obviously tempted by the success that the women of Kudumbashri had achieved. Now, these 4.2 million women means that this movement has a member from every second household of the state. They operate on a principle. I mean, they have millions of different activities. Kudumbashri is into, by the way, they hate the word self-help. They very correctly see it as a neoliberal concept. They believe in community help. I'm there for you, you're there for me. So they have a community development system. They call their movement Kudumbashri or CDS locally. And it's to do with the Kudumbam, with the family, with the neighborhood groups. Among the various activities they're in, they even run garages on the highway. And they have a branded coffee. But the most important activity of Kudumbashri, in my opinion, is what are called the Sangha Krishis, the women's group farming activities. Believe it or not, there are now 47,000 of them. Maybe it's gone to 50,000. When I last saw, it was 47,000. These may be groups of 10 to 15, 18 to 20 women, most of them usually landless. Okay? They lease land, trying to use the government as an umpire in the rate of lease, trying to get the collector and others involved in that, doing some kind of bargaining. And on the land they lease, mostly they are growing food crop in a state which is, I don't know, 80%, 90% cash crop. But they are growing food crop. In the villages of Kerala today, if you come across patches of food crop, the chances are 7 on 10 that Kudumbashri is some way involved in it. In a state that has become dependent on food import, here are these women restoring paddy land. They're taking land that has laid fallow, cultivated it, readied it, prepared it, revived the land, rejuvenated the soil, and are growing food crop. And they're doing it on very low chemical inputs or none at all. Some of them are into natural farming, some of them are into organic farming, some of them are into LISA, low input sustainable agriculture, and they are functioning on a principle which they see as going far beyond food sovereignty or food security. They will tell you with great clarity that our principle is food justice. Right? Now here is how their thing works very briefly. If there are 18, 20 women in the group, in the Kudumbashri group, running a Sangha Krishi, and the acreage may be in different parts of the village, whatever. If that Sangha Krishi has 18 members and it produces something, some food crop, the rule is that first, the needs of those 18 families must be met before you can send the surplus to market. That's justice. The producer, those who produce the food, should not go hungry. So first the needs of the member families have to be met, and then you can send the surplus to the market. That has happened. And I will also tell you that this is the point, and this is the central point. I'm so glad somebody asked me this question, because I completely forgot to mention it. It's had a dramatic effect on credit, on banking, on all kinds of relations in the village. In many villages of Kerala, Kudumbashri is the main depositor in the bank, which means that the bank manager, the bank, has to behave very differently with Kudumbashri. Otherwise, they can simply withdraw their deposit from your bank and go to another. The point is collective strength. It's group farming, collective farming in a sense. It is joint collective effort. They're not individuals. They call themselves, very correctly, a solidarity economy. They're there for each other. It's not individual neoliberal self-help, pulling up yourself by the bootstraps, and everybody can't sell eggs to everybody else in the village. Here are people they're not entrepreneurs in an individual sense. They are very successful group farmers. They have made a huge success of it, despite the gigantic costs, despite the fact that they don't have land. We could actually be thinking about how we can create Kudumbashris all around the country. And indeed, the rural ministries, rural departments of 7 other states have asked Kudumbashri, from Assam to Bihar, have asked them to come there and set up similar Kudumbashri type movements over there. So I think there are very bright and positive things happening, though Kudumbashri is only a beginning. It needs to go much further, and it will find it difficult to go further because of the hostility of a situation where agriculture is simply being handed over to the corporate.
Sainath, we've got 20 minutes past time. We'll just take one last question.
Okay, one last question. I'm told we are desperately way past time. Yeah.
So it's often it is forgotten that farmer widows are farmers themselves. With most of them not even having the lands under their names, what is the sustainable solution for them?
First is to get them. Okay, I'll repeat. Can you repeat the question? Okay, farmers, widows. Are they farmers themselves, or are they just farmers' widows, or and do they have land under their names? And is there a sustainable way out of this problem?
Gayatri Prakash asked this.
Yeah, well, Gayatri, I have to tell you that this is something that I've been writing on for 17 years. That the so-called farmers' widows are farmers. Firstly, over 60% of work in agriculture in this country is done by women, but their names don't come onto the pattas. Okay, they're not by law but by custom. So society treats them as farmers' wives, though they are the main farmer in many cases, the main farmer on that piece of land, in that plot, in that cultivated area. The second thing is that when it also helps fudge and falsify the statistics on farmers' suicides. Very large numbers of women farmers have committed suicide. Yeah, but they are not registered as farmers' suicides. They're registered as women's suicides. Maharashtra government in 2007 introduced some wonderful categories: farmers' suicides and farmers' relative suicides. I suggested that they introduce farmers, friends, and Mitra Mandali society suicides as well. The idea has always been to cut the numbers by pushing women into the other columns. So you find that states like Punjab and Haryana show 0 women farmers suicides. And if you look at the general women's suicides, those columns are exploding. Most of them are farm girls, farm women. Now, there's been some very stupid, smug research on this, where people saying, aha, more women are committing suicide than farmers. And it's precisely the kind of stupidity that you're pointing to, correctly, in my opinion. There have been a couple of, researchers who have never visited a farm household, wouldn't know a farmer if he kicked them in the slats, yeah, and who have no understanding of what the woman's role in farming is, saying, well, look at this, the number of women's suicides is greater than farm suicides. You know what they're saying? They're saying that women cannot be farmers. They're saying that farmers cannot be women. Okay? The fact is that very large numbers of women farmers are committing suicide. The daughters of farmers are committing suicide, of women farmers and men farmers. The girls are committing suicide. This is a very large part of your unseen suicide crisis. It's been written about. You can go back and look at it in the Hindu. I don't know how many pieces, and a whole 2 series on women farmers after the suicide, where we make clear that they are farmers. Now,
we have them up on party.
We have them up. Again, Gayatri, please visit the People's Archive of Rural India, and you'll see a number of stories on women farmers who have suffered a suicide by their spouse, or someone in the house by their son, or whatever. The thing is this, that we don't allow women to be on that patta. We don't want to give them property rights. We deny them property rights as a society, and therefore they're not going to be counted as farmers. And this is a very simple thing in the counting process. Oh, incidentally, Maharashtra and Rajasthan suddenly showed an increase in the number of women farmers. Why? Because the governments gave a concession on registration of land fees. Say if it's about 12,000 rupees, you were given a 30% off, or a 30% off, one third remission in the registration cost if your wife's name was on it. So suddenly, tens of thousands of women's names mysteriously appeared in the registered deed, though mostly the women didn't know about it. It's a good thing for the future, but I'm just telling you how the manipulation takes place. Women are the mainstay of Indian farming, and as the migration out of farming takes place, their work has doubled. Earlier, they were always looking after the entire dairying, livestock care. Now, their role has doubled in crop agriculture as well, because the men have either migrated out of the village or out of farming into other professions. So the load on the women agriculturists, on the woman farmer, has grown exponentially, and we just refuse to recognize her as a farmer. That is something that can be changed. It can be changed by law. There were laws in some states like Bengal where government redistributed land had to be a joint patta, including the woman's name, which also protects her from being thrown off the land. There's tons we can do. I'm saying it again. You can read a lot of these stories on women farmers on the People's Archive of Rural India, ruralindiaonline.org, and these are the very issues, Gayatri, that we should be discussing in that 10-day session in Parliament.
A lot of people are asking us to continue, but I think we should. It's been 26 minutes past.
Well, what do we do?
We could continue if you want to continue.
5 minutes.
5 more minutes.
5 minutes. Look, I can't do more than that, but we'll come back. We'll make this a more regular thing, okay? On very specific. I think the discussion on the cattle economy is another conversation. I think the discussion on the slaughter of suicides data, that's a whole conversation. Like I mentioned just now, the fraud in trying to pit women's suicides against farmers' suicides. How do you compare a gender and an occupation? It's so stupid.
You've probably already covered this, but there are people really asking for your comments on MSP. If you covered MSP and UPI, and will UPI be enough in Manrega and everything? Subsidies will go away in coming up? Yeah.
And also, I feel agriculture is purposefully being made non-profitable for the farmers, so that they're forced to make it.
No, well, it's absolutely correct that agriculture is being made non-profitable for farmers. It's being made non-profitable for farmers, and it will become terribly profitable for corporations when the farmers have given up on it. That's one thing. Your the question was on
MSP.
MSP. There is a huge, and part of that drive is a whole right-wing neoliberal gang going after the MSP, saying the entire MSP system has got to be dropped. The minimum support price. I'm saying the MSP system has to be there, and it's got to be made to work. It's got the actual cultivator, the actual producer has to benefit from the MSP. That's not going to happen unless the state intervenes to see that it happens. But if you don't have the MSP, now I'm not going to get into that debate because I start from the understanding that the Swaminathan Commission has got it right. I'm saying let's figure out the cost of production and then figure out what the MSP should be, what that 50% should be. We can do that. But I also want to tell I want to address this very silly and ignorant idea about subsidies in agriculture. In India, we are the world's greatest in just about everything, right? from Pushpak Vimana 50,000 years ago to nuclear weapons. Every day there's a headline: India third greatest in this, India fourth great, number one on happiness index. The fact is that with a population of 1.28 billion, you've got to be the third biggest everything. Something. There is no agriculture in the world. There is no agriculture in the world that is proceeding on the basis of no subsidy. The question in the real world is whether you give life support subsidies to the farmers or public money to the corporations. The largest subsidies in the world in agriculture go to corporations. Please look at the United States and the EU. In 2006-07, the United States was subsidizing its cotton producers, which were essentially businesses, not farmers. The United States subsidy for its cotton businesses was higher than the total value of the cotton produced in the United States. Now, if their technology, if their agriculture, if corporate agriculture is so incredibly efficient, why did the subsidy have to be bigger than the total value of the crop? As the US started raising unbelievable subsidies for its businesses, for its cotton incorporated guys, the EU responded. Now, Europe, I think there are only 2 or 3 countries that have a climate where you can think of growing cotton. One is one is Spain, and the other is Portugal. But the EU matched the United States dollar for euro in subsidies to cotton. The result was that cotton prices tanked around the world. They tanked around the world. You'll see that from 1998 onwards, these battles are on. And you'll see this in the unbelievable fluctuation of prices at the Chicago Cotton Exchange. Sometimes cotton ruling at 110 cents a pound, falling to 38 cents a pound. And you will find with these convulsions, cotton growers' suicides, the largest single group in this country, not just in India, but in Benin, Chad, Malawi, in all the West African countries where cotton is the main meal ticket. So please understand, the subsidies gave just because they define subsidies in a way, your subsidy is my incentive. We do that too. You give 5 paisa to a poor person, it's a subsidy. You give 9,000 crores to Vijay Mallya, that's an incentive. An incentive to what? I have no idea. But it's an incentive, right? You give, you're talking about 40,000 crores or 50,000 crores waiver for millions and millions of people, but you're willing to give a $1 billion loan to Adani, greater than the entire farmer debt of this country, from a single bank. Yeah. So understand this, that agriculture, the production of food, I don't know that there is a more important activity of the human race than the production of food. And every single country invests in its agriculture. Now, agriculture is the lowest paid sector. Wages are lowest, incomes are lowest, everything is lowest. So I don't see where this country exists, where that economy exists, where agriculture is not supported by the state. My question is, should it be supporting the food production of the Indian people, or should it be supporting corporate profit? Who you give that money to is the question, not whether you will invest money in agriculture. I think, guys, I've got to take it there. The support that I have is waning at this end. They're absolutely tired after an hour and a half. We'll return for further conversations. Thank you. And go back Please surf ruralindiaonline.org tonight to see your stories on Kudumbashri, to see the stories on women farmers, to see the stories on farm widows, to see the stories on suicide stats. Please look at ruralindiaonline.org. You'll be able to look at farming through the lives of farmers. Thank you. Good night.